All right, so if you're watching this, it's because I assume you have gone and done those group discussion questions, and now you're back to see the rest of class. So I'm going to go in this video. I'm going to go over that handout that you worked on, and then I'm also going to finish up with a few more things. Okay, so the first question was, right, solar only operates at a 14 capacity on average. Why do you think that that is? And I hope that this was easy because we've already talked about it in class, right? This is the issue of solar being intermittent, both because, right, the solar resource varies by time of year and time of day, and also that sometimes there's clouds in the way. How much solar PV is estimated to be installed worldwide in 2018 and 2019? You can read those numbers off the graph. But if you continue at this rate, how much will be installed by 2030? This could be a pretty hard question if you took it as a real exponential growth problem, like maybe you did. But in 2018 and between 2018 and 2019, we added over 100 gigawatts of PV capacity. And even if we didn't consider this to be exponential growth, even if we just said 100 gigawatts every year, right? That's like replacing 100 coal power plants every year. So we are on a pretty steep exponential growth curve for that. Which countries are the big players in adding solar PV to their electricity mix? So I see that the green here is Europe, the yellow is Middle East and Africa, North America, China, and the rest of the world. Okay, so I see the Middle East and Africa as getting lumped together. I'm not really sure why they would get lumped together, but one thing that goes on in poorer nations is that these might be places that aren't on the grid at all right now. So solar is a great resource for them because they are able to they're able to get electricity without having to install a huge grid system like what we have in the US with telephone poles and wires that go everywhere. North America is lagging behind, right? We have a huge population, but we are doing less than Europe and China are doing. That's changing. It will continue to change, but in general, we've been a little slow to the addition mix. This is the projected solar capacity that we're going to add over this 4-year time period, and let's look at the 5 states that are going to contribute the most to solar PV. So I have California, Florida, Texas, North Carolina, Arizona, and actually let's go all the way to 6 so we can put New York in there. So why on earth is New York adding more solar than Nevada is, right? Nevada was the hot spot in all of the US for solar resource, and yet they're investing less than New York is. And this comes down to infrastructure that's put in place to incentivize people transitioning to solar. New York has a lot of incentives for transitioning people to solar. Nevada has a lot of disincentives for transferring people to solar. A lot of this comes down to the idea of net metering, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, but there's some other states here that don't make a lot of sense either, like North Carolina. Why is North Carolina so high? It certainly was not a good solar resource state. Florida, not as good as Nevada, but certainly a southern state that had a lot of solar resource. California makes a lot of sense, right? California is leading the way here. They were a state that had a ton of solar resource, and they're also a state that's really emphasizing and supporting the construction of solar power plants in their state. To give you an example of that, California just recently passed a law that is going to basically require that every new structure that is built in the entire state has to have solar panels on the roof. And I want you to think about whether this is good or bad, okay? So from the perspective of getting solar to be in more places, that's unequivocally a good thing, right? But from the perspective of having to pay for that, that could be a bad thing, right? California is ground zero for having people get priced out of living in their communities. And you have just added an extra $15,000 cost to the price of putting up a new home. So that, and that is prohibitive in a lot of cases. So, right, it's a mixed bag. It's good and it's bad. It's not everything. And I think this statement here is pretty notable, right? 18 states are going to add more than 80% of the solar installations. So this is really something that is breaking down more so by our, and oftentimes I'm going to say political allegiances, because it tends to fall into the liberal incentivizes solar and the Democrat and the Republican doesn't. Though that's obviously not entirely the case. There's plenty of other things going on, but it does kind of tend to fall that way. But right, there is the states that are emphasizing giving good incentives for people to install solar are winning this race, and other states are just way behind. In terms of solar capacity that's added, right? So this is a plot of the US, and now the size of the blue dot is the size of a solar plant that has been added. So a big blue dot is a big solar farm. So there's a bunch of big solar farms out here in the Southwest. And it's plotted up against where the resource is. So we saw that, right, here's North Carolina here, right? North Carolina is this big swath of giant blue dots. North Carolina has really been incentivizing net metering and all sorts of other things in their state to get people to install solar. And right next door, there's Tennessee. Here's West Virginia, has almost no solar in it whatsoever. West Virginia is kind of the lone state along the East Coast that seems to be actively de-incentivizing people from going solar. So there is that. Okay, so fossil fuels are 67% of New York's power generating capacity, but only 41% of its production. And let's give a reason why that might be. The reason that is the main reason why I think this must be is this issue with solar, with renewables being intermittent. Okay, so we have a lot of power plants that exist just to turn on when renewables aren't functioning. So we have to overbuild our system for fossil fuel power plants to take into account the fact that wind and solar are pretty intermittent. When does electricity demand peak in New York? So the time of day is the middle of the day. And so this down here is the hour of the day. So you can see that, right, 16, 17, that's 5 and 6 p.m., right? That's when it peaks. We get home, we turn on the lights, we start cooking dinner. That's when it peaks. So time of day is in the middle, late afternoon, early evening. And in the season, of course, the season is summer, right? The blue curve, this dark blue curve is higher than all of the other seasons at every time of the day. So, and also, so why do you think, and when does it peak is, I think actually this plot is a different question that is not this question. Okay, so why do you think this is? Right, this is when we're using the most electricity because of air conditioners. So I'm going to skip that. And then what is the typical load in New York and what is the record peak load? And if you're designing a grid, do you want to design a grid that can handle the average load or the peak load? So that is this plot right here, right? So here's the average load and here's the peak load and there's the record peak, 33,956 megawatts. And if you're designing a grid, you have to design it for this peak load here, right? You can't have the power go off ever, okay? And especially important that the power doesn't go off during the peak load day because the peak load day is the hottest day of the year. If the power goes out during the hottest day of the year, then vulnerable populations of people who need access to things like air conditioning don't have it. So we design almost all the time, we're kicking right down here around like less than 20,000. But one day of the year or 1 week or 2 weeks of the year, we have to be up here over 30,000. So we have to design our entire energy system around this one day, our peak load. And of course, the peak load is going to go up as the climate warms because the probably the most robust prediction that I can make for you is that in the future, the temperature will be warmer on the hottest day of the year, right? Heat waves will get worse. The last question was the record peak demand occurred at the end of an intense heat wave in July 2013, and does that make sense? That this is why we would have our peak demand, and the answer to that is yes, because that's when we turn on our air conditioners. And this last question here is about a duck curve. And so this is called a duck curve. It's not more fancy than that. This looks like a duck. Okay. So what is going on here is it doesn't say it. There's no x-axis label here, so I apologize for that. These are the hours of the day. So here's the morning, here's midday, and here's evening. And this is an example of a utility company that I found that kind of posted their hour by hour things. This was last February, I think, is when I looked this up. And so the orange here is the total demand that that all the people that use this utility over the course of that day had for the day, and the green was the total load except for the wind and the solar. And this is a big infrastructure problem that people are working on, which is that sun peaks during the day. Okay, so this is this plot up here on the top is telling me over the course of the hour of the day, so 1 a.m., 2 a.m., noon, 1 p.m., 2 p.m., midnight, how much energy was coming from all these different kinds. So I have renewables here on the bottom. Nuclear is the next one up. Thermal is the first blue one, so that's geothermal, like people getting hot heat from the ground. Imports, that is that we are just deciding to import electricity from a nearby state, and then hydro up here. So this is a utility that is trying its best to go carbon free. It's not producing any fossil fuels at all. But you can see that they have this problem, which is that in the middle of the day, they don't have to import very much. But at night, they have to import a ton. So if you want to think about being California and having to import a ton of fossil fuel energy from Nevada in the middle of the night, if Nevada starts moving in this direction, well, now all of a sudden California can't get energy from Nevada because Nevada has this same problem. Okay, and we can't ship energy from China, right? That doesn't work. We can't like lay a cord and get energy all the way from China. So this is the problem, right? It's very easy to imagine going to a climate where we're getting, say, 50, maybe even 60% of our electricity from renewables. But it's very hard to imagine. It presents a lot of challenges when we move up above that. All right. And you can actually see also nuclear. This is one reason why people are pro-nuclear, right? So nuclear is able to stay steady, right? It has no intermittency issues, and nuclear is also carbon-free. Hydro, more or less the same thing there too, right? There's obviously some seasonal cycle to hydro, right? This is flowing of water in rivers, and anybody who's ever watched the Hudson through a season knows that, right, there's times of the year where there's a lot of flow and there's times of the year where there's less flow. So there's a little bit of seasonality to hydro, but it's certainly quite a bit more predictable than solar and wind. Okay, so why don't we have solar everywhere? And the real answer here is plain old, regular old, just economics, okay? In the year 2001, the cost to install solar was 13 cents, between 13 and 30 cents per kilowatt hour. And if you wanted to install a fossil fuel power plant, it was 6. No one is going to make this choice, okay? If you want to have people choose solar in a situation like this, you have to subsidize it. You have to incentivize it, okay? And I mean, this is 2001 dollars, so we will talk about what has happened in the last 10 years, which is like sort of the news flashes that this is no longer 13 cents. It's come way down from that so that it's now cost competitive with fossil fuels. But we subsidize fossil fuels and nuclear energy in a big way. Right, you want there's all sorts of sort of things built into the system to lower the cost of oil or things like that. Okay, we don't subsidize any sort of renewables. We don't subsidize renewables in big ways, right? So this was 2011. You can't say like this was during the Obama administration. This is not some sort of like the federal government hates renewables thing going on here. So if you want to make solar competitive, you can subsidize it, okay? And renewables do get less subsidies and have fewer environmental impacts. One example of a subsidy that has been growing in demand is net metering. So this home here in Maine produces more electricity than it uses, and it sells the excess to a local power company. So I have a little video that I want to show you about that. So this is going to cycle over the course of the day and explain to you how net metering works as being a homeowner. Like, how does this work out for you? So before I play this video, the idea with net metering is that I can put solar panels on the roof of my house, and instead of those solar panels actually powering my home, which they do not do, what they do is they connect directly to the grid. So when there is sun, that energy that's being produced by my solar panels is I'm just a little miniature power plant uploading onto the grid. And I get paid for uploading onto the grid. Okay, so the power company has to pay me for the electricity that I produce. All right, I'm not pausing it, but muting it so that it doesn't interfere with the sound of my voice. So you can see that we've sort of woken up and our power demand has skyrocketed, but the sun is still very much beginning. So right now we are downloading from the grid, and you can see these red arrows are showing electricity coming into the house. Yeah, and it's very irregular, right? As little things go on and off, it's not just this smooth and steady thing. All right, and there we are over the course of the day. Sort of the sun has done this and our demand has done this. And so over the course of the day, we've been downloading from the grid. We've also been uploading it from the grid. And so this is like our own little mini duck curve that we have created here. Right, so we're producing an excess here, and so we're uploading to the grid in the morning, we're uploading to the grid during the day when we have this excess of electricity. We're downloading from the grid during this. And so if you have a home that is set up, for net metering, then during the middle of the day, when you are uploading to the grid, you're actually getting paid for that. And during the other times, you are paying to download it. And actually, over the course of your electricity bill, it will just be sort of a monthly thing. So you would put solar panels on the roof of your house to try to match. They produce so that kind of over the course of the year, probably you're paying about nothing. And that's generally how this works. And I think this makes it really clear why utilities hate this idea, okay? So utilities are already having to deal with utility scale solar coming online and having this duck curve problem, right? Which is that, right, when the peak demand happens, that doesn't necessarily match when the peak supply is. And now they have to deal with it from individual people, and they have to pay for this electricity that's occurring on the grid when they didn't need it. So you want to talk, and like they still have to design their grid to be able to handle the hottest day of the year, and this doesn't necessarily impact how they have to design their grid to be handled there. So it's a great deal for a homeowner who can put solar panels on the roof of their house and basically get free electricity from those solar panels. But from the utilities perspective, this presents some challenges for them. All right, so, right, if you were a utility company, would you like this, right? The utility provides the power and the customer supports more power here. So right now, right, we can't just turn our power plant off and then back on and then off and then back on, right? Power plants need a little more predictability than that. Um, so this is a challenge for utilities. And it's why utilities have really lobbied against allowing net metering. And so there are some states that allow net metering where you can get paid for uploading to the grid. New York is one of them, and there are some states that don't. And that is the main difference in those maps of why certain states had big electricity resources and some certain states didn't. Locally, I see this all over. Right, there's solar panels everywhere in Albany and the whole capital region. Um, and so I guess the question to you is, do you have solar panels on the roof of your house? And when I have asked this question in front of big groups of people, the answer is usually no. And if the answer is yes, it's because it's a person that lives with their parents. Right? So this is something that is absolutely like something that helps people who already own their own homes and are already financially stable stay more financially stable. And it does not help people like renters. Okay, so if you rent, you don't own the roof of your house, and you have no incentive to be putting these cost saving things on the roof of your house. And so a lot of the design of this policy has unfortunately been pretty regressive, right? It penalizes the poor half of the population and it rewards the already well-off half of the population. This is changing, but it's still a very big problem. So one thing that New York State is moving towards is this idea of community solar, which is that rather than I don't own my own roof, but I could buy a share in a solar farm somewhere far away. And then I could buy that share in that solar farm far away, and that allows me to participate in this net metering, even though the solar panels aren't on the roof of my house. Okay, so, and we just talked about how we would incentivize solar, like we need to subsidize it. But it turns out that solar is becoming cost competitive and we don't even need subsidies. Okay, so grid parity is this thing that is when electricity from solar reaches the same price as the fossil fuels, then we'll say that that place has reached grid parity. Okay, and so the greens and the blues here are places that have already reached grid parity, which is that if I'm going to choose to put up a power plant, I may just choose to put up a solar plant because it's cheaper. Okay, and there's several states in the US that have already reached grid parity. And there's many more states that are sort of in the pipeline for reaching grid parity. And there's many countries in the US or countries in the world that are on that same trajectory. I must keep doing something that I don't understand to make my screen do that. Okay. And what about batteries? So everybody always tells me that well, we can't store electricity. Well, I've got a way to store electricity with my phone. So why can't we just put a battery in it and we can hold that electricity for a few hours, we can hold it overnight and do that? And the answer is that we are absolutely moving there. But we are not there yet because batteries are really expensive, even though they keep getting cheaper. So let me show you what I mean as I get this up. Awesome. Uh-oh. Okay. So why batteries can't be the only solution. Let's talk about why batteries are not the only solution. Oh, that is upside down, isn't it? Let's fix that. There we go. Instead of solution, let's say the only solution. Right. They're certainly part of the plan, but they're not the only part of the plan. Okay, so I just a few minutes ago went and looked up the cost for storage. Okay, so cost for a battery, a wholesale battery. That's $375 per kilowatt hour. And I just want to say that since I started teaching this class 6 years ago, this number has come down by like a factor of 10. It was well over 1,000 when I first started teaching this class. So the cost for batteries has gone down. It continues to go down. And this is why battery powered cars are becoming more of a thing and all sorts of things like that are becoming more of a thing. I just want to use this and do a little bit of conversion factor analysis to figure out what that actually means. Okay, so this is, let's convert this to gigawatts. So $375 per 1 kilowatt hour. And we'll say that one power plant is about 1 gigawatt, right? I've said that before. So a single coal or natural gas power plant produces about 1 gigawatt of power, which means that it produces 1 gigawatt hour every hour of energy. Okay, so I want to figure out how much it's going to cost to build a battery that supplies 1 hour's worth of electricity that could come from this power plant. So I want to convert kilowatt hours to gigawatt hours. And the conversion factor for that is that there are 10 to the 6 kilowatt hours in 1 gigawatt hour. So I'll do that. And I have 375 times a million. Well, that is 375 million. So that's 375 million dollars to build a battery that can store the energy that this one power plant can produce in a single hour. We're not talking about, so we want to do it overnight. Let's just say, let's do it times 8 hours. Oh geez, I didn't calculate that number. But let's call this 400 million times 8. Geez, we're very easily getting into multiple billions of dollars just to have a battery that can do what this, I don't know, $4 million power plant is doing every day. It's prohibitively expensive. I went ahead and calculated cost for 1 gigawatt. A 1 gigawatt power powers about 725,000 homes. Okay, so New York City's battery for 8 hours. Okay, so let's say we need to store 8 hours worth of electricity to get us through the night. It's not a full 12 hours because not everybody we don't use as much electricity at night, so we can get away with 8. New York City has 8.6 million people. So that's more than 100 times bigger than this number here. And I'm going to save you the math, but this was $300 trillion. Let's compare that to the US GDP. All of the economic activity of the entire United States, that's $20 trillion a year. Okay, so why can't we just use a battery? That's why we can't just use a battery, right? There's no way that we are paying for something like this. It's impossible. One thing that I've seen a lot of interest in the last year is people talking about, well, solar is so cheap. Instead of building batteries, why don't we just like build 10 times as many solar plants as we need? And when we don't need them, we just turn them off. And they're not producing electricity. When we do need them, we turn them on. I think that has come a long way in terms of being maybe the next best option that's a little better than the battery option. I'm not saying that batteries aren't a part of the solution. They absolutely are. But batteries are never going to be something that, say, gets us through seasons. Okay. So they probably will be things that get us overnight, right? So we can store enough electricity to get us through overnight. But to deal with seasonal storage, so now we have to build a battery that's so giant that it can take into account the fact that we get way more energy from the sun in the summer than we do in the winter. So we need to store some of the sun's energy in the summer all the way until the winter. I don't think that's ever going to happen. It's just not practical. It's too expensive. There's other things that we'll do before we do that. Okay, and I think that is all that I had for today. So thanks for coming. I hope you made it until the end, and kudos to you if you did. And I will see you again next week.